The year was 1845, and in the rolling farmland of Indiana, a grand brick poorhouse rose out of the earth like a promise. It was built with county money and blessed by ministers who told their congregations that this house would be a sanctuary for the forgotten, the sick, the homeless, the old, the orphaned. Its walls stretched long and heavy, its windows narrow and watching, its hallways designed for efficiency rather than comfort. On the outside, it stood as a beacon of mercy in a land where poverty spread like rot. But inside those bricks, something colder was already taking root, something that would twist the purpose of charity into a silent machinery of death. From the first week, the ledgers began to record their losses. A woman brought in with swollen legs was declared dead within 2 days, though her neighbor claimed she had been seen at the window after the date of her supposed passing. A child left by the county court vanished into the halls, the paperwork signed and sealed, though no burial took place. Each name was crossed out with quiet neatness, and when families inquired about their kin, they were told only that disease had claimed them and their bodies had been disposed of for the sake of public health. There were no coffins carried out, no wagons to the churchyard, no markers in the soil, only silence. And silence was accepted because the poor did not have voices loud enough to rise against the word of officials. The residents felt the shift long before outsiders noticed. They felt it in the way footsteps echoed too heavily at night, in the way locks clicked behind doors that were never supposed to be locked, in the way the chapel candles burned too long as though someone were performing rituals at hours when no service was held. The first arrivals whispered that the poorhouse was swallowing people whole, that the beds filled in the morning were empty by evening, and that the only trace of their companions was a line in a book, cold ink replacing flesh and bone. Fear grew in the corridors, a fear without proof, for every disappearance was smoothed over with perfect paperwork and official signatures. The county inspectors came once, strolling the halls with hands behind their backs, nodding at the order of it all. The residents were lined up, the weak and fevered pressed forward to prove that the institution was fulfilling its duty. The ledgers were opened, each death recorded in tidy script explained as consumption, flux, or fever. No inspector asked to see the graves. No inspector wondered why the numbers did not match the bodies. In their eyes, the poorhouse was a success, an efficient shield against the shame of vagrancy. They left satisfied, never knowing that their presence had only tightened the veil of silence further. Those who remained inside carried the burden of dread with them to their straw mattresses each night. Every cough felt like a sentence, every stumble a warning. They watched each other not with solidarity but with suspicion, for none could say where the missing had gone, and none wished to be the next one marked in the ledger. Mothers held their children closer. Elders tried not to show weakness, and the strong whispered prayers they no longer believed would be heard. What haunted them most was not the sound of violence, but the absence of sound, the way names vanished without struggle, without cry, without even the mercy of farewell. The poorhouse had been built as a monument to Christian charity, but already it was a monument to something else, to the quiet erasure of human lives under the cloak of necessity. No grave diggers were hired, no carpenters paid to shape coffins, no black soil turned to receive the bodies. Instead, the land remained untouched while inside the walls the count of the dead grew, an invisible cemetery without earth or stone. The ground around the poorhouse looked clean, but beneath that cleanliness lay the weight of lies too heavy for the living to carry. And so, from the moment its doors opened, the poorhouse was not a home for the destitute, but a stage where suffering was hidden behind neat curtains of paper and ink. Each disappearance pressed deeper into the minds of those who survived, reshaping their thoughts until trust became impossible, until every sound in the night became a signal of dread. The records told of a place where people died quickly and quietly, But the truth was that the poorhouse had already begun to strip life away in ways too subtle for the world outside to notice. What began as whispers of vanishing would harden into decades of silence, a silence that fed upon the weak and left no grave to mark its hunger. The arrival of shadows was complete. Elias Harrow was a man who seemed built for invisibility. He spoke in soft tones, his posture modest, his face a pale mask of patience that never betrayed agitation. To the county officials, he was a godsend, a man who could bring order to the chaos of the destitute. He wore simple suits, clean but never extravagant, and when he greeted inspectors, he bowed his head just enough to be read as humble. His reputation spread quickly. Here was a warden who ran the poorhouse with calm authority, who respected the church, who kept impeccable records. In a world eager to bury the shame of poverty, Harrow's neatness was seen as virtue. No one asked what his order cost the residents because no one wanted to look past the page. The ledger was his true cathedral. He wrote in it daily the names of the living and the names of the dead, his script flawless, each letter angled with care. The deaths were recorded with exact times, exact causes, as though science itself had guided his hand. Yet every entry was less a record than a ritual, each stroke of ink another step in the silent ceremony of control. Harrow was not a man who killed in rage or passion. His cruelty was careful, deliberate, folded into the very structure of administration. To him, the residents were not people but pieces of a grand puzzle, and their suffering was the thread that stitched the puzzle together. It began with small adjustments, invisible to those outside. An old man with a weak heart was made to climb stairs again and again until his chest failed. His death was recorded as natural, his body removed quietly in the night. A young woman recovering from fever was bled until her lips turned blue. Her blood collected in bowls and poured into the soil behind the poorhouse, as though Harrow were feeding the earth itself. To him, every act of suffering carried meaning, every death a number that balanced the hidden equation of his mind. And when he returned to the ledger, his hand never trembled. He signed their endings with the same calm one might use to sign a receipt. The staff, few and powerless, began to sense his rituals but could not resist them. They saw how he arranged the sick in rows, how he chose who would be denied food for days under the pretense of rations, how he timed the length of coughs as though measuring endurance. Harrow did not strike or shout, yet his presence alone froze them. He gave orders in the form of suggestions, always soft, always logical, so that disobedience felt like irrational rebellion. And so they obeyed, even as the air grew heavy with dread. They obeyed because Harrow's calmness was more terrifying than violence, a still surface beneath which cruelty flowed unseen. To the county board he presented only the ledgers bound and clean, filled with columns of names neatly ended. They admired his thoroughness, his precision, his devotion to accuracy. The deaths were unfortunate, yes, but the poor were always vulnerable, always on the edge of collapse. Harrow's work was seen as mercy, a necessary caretaker in a world where the weak could not survive long. He was praised in sermons as a man of discipline, the very opposite of corruption. What none of them understood was that his very neatness was the corruption, the ledger itself the weapon with which he reshaped lives into silence. But behind the calm mask, Harrow was not indifferent. He felt something close to ecstasy in the act of transforming a life into a line of ink. Each victim fed his hunger for control, each death an act of purification in his private faith. He believed the poorhouse was not merely an institution but a vessel, and he its priest. His violence was not for pleasure alone but for order, as though suffering was the only honest language of the human condition. The residents existed to be measured, tested, reduced, erased until only numbers remained. And with each passing week, as the population thinned and the pages filled, Harrow felt closer to the perfection he sought. A world without noise, without struggle, only the stillness of names crossed out in black. The residents saw it in his eyes, even if no one else did. When Harrow walked the corridors, silence followed. Men who had once whispered in defiance stopped speaking altogether. Women clutched their children tighter, knowing the ledger would someday carry their names. The fear he spread was not of sudden violence, but of inevitability. His calm face told them their fate was already sealed, that resistance was pointless. In their dreams, they did not see knives or whips. They saw his hand turning pages, his pen gliding smoothly across their existence until nothing remained but a line, a number, a mark of finality. By the time winter settled over the land, the poorhouse had already become less a refuge and more a trap. Elias Harrow stood at the center of it all, a man praised as mild and merciful, even as the walls absorbed the quiet despair of those who knew what his ledgers meant. And still the deaths continued, methodical and unchallenged, each one a carefully constructed erasure. With every entry, Harrow's world became more complete, more ordered, more bound to his vision of silent perfection. The poorhouse was his kingdom, and the ledger was his scripture. And in his scripture, every name would someday be crossed out. The disappearances began quietly, as if the poorhouse itself had swallowed its residents whole. At first it was the elderly, those who came in frail and already bent beneath the weight of years. One man, Jacob Mallory, had been seen warming his hands by the kitchen stove on a bitter morning. Yet 2 days later, the ledger declared him dead of fever. No burial followed. No procession to the churchyard, only the mark of his name crossed out in Elias Harrow's neat hand. When neighbors who lived near the poorhouse whispered that they had glimpsed Jacob leaning against the barred window the very night after his supposed death, their voices were dismissed as confusion. The poor were often forgotten quickly, and so his vanishing stirred no outrage beyond those trapped inside. For Harrow, these first deaths were not accidents or opportunities, but carefully planned beginnings. He had long imagined the rituals, rehearsed them in his mind until they became a liturgy of cruelty. He believed sickness was too random, too careless, and he sought instead to create sickness on his own terms, to direct it like a conductor guiding a slow symphony of suffering. The old and the weak became his first subjects, because their deaths could be explained without protest. No one expected them to live long, and so no one asked why their endings were so sudden, so silent, so precise. In the cellar of the poorhouse, Harrow had built wooden harnesses, crude frames bound with leather straps, where a body could be fixed upright without escape. The walls of the cellar were damp, the air thick with mildew, but to Harrow it was a sanctuary, a chamber of truth. Here he carried the first victims, lowering them into place, tightening the straps until frail limbs were pinned like insects in glass. From a kettle he poured water into an iron bowl, setting it above a small flame until it boiled. He then filled a ladle and began his ritual of drops, one scalding bead at a time, released from above to fall on bare skin. The hiss of flesh blistering beneath water was soft, almost gentle, but it drew out screams that clawed through stone. The torture was designed to mimic fever. Harrow believed that suffering should not appear as murder but as illness, the body's own betrayal. He dripped the water in careful rhythm, leaving time between drops so that pain stretched longer, so that the victim's mind swam in anticipation as much as in agony. Skin swelled, cracked, and wept, but the old could not endure. After hours, their hearts failed, their bodies sagged against the harness, lifeless yet marked by the signs of a feverish burn. To Harrow, their deaths were perfect, clean, believable, invisible to any who would glance upon the body before disposal. Each time he returned to the ledger, he wrote the cause as fever, his script immaculate, as though God himself had confirmed the diagnosis. He felt no guilt, only satisfaction, for to him the poor were raw clay and suffering was the fire that gave them form. What he created was not life, but death crafted with intention, and in this act he felt a twisted form of artistry. The residents soon sensed the pattern, though none dared speak too loudly. They saw how the weakest disappeared first, how the sound of faint cries drifted from beneath the chapel, how beds were stripped before dawn as though their owners had never existed. Fear grew sharper than hunger, sharper than cold. Mothers who once prayed aloud now whispered only to themselves, clutching children who would not sleep. The hallways seemed haunted not by spirits but by the knowledge that their own bodies might soon be claimed for Harrow's quiet rituals. To Harrow, this terror was not an unwanted side effect but part of the design. He watched the way fear hollowed eyes, how it made voices falter, how it bent the will of even the strongest. Fear made the poorhouse manageable, orderly, docile. The residents no longer resisted commands or begged for mercy. They shuffled silently, afraid that any word might be the one that placed them next on the ledger. Harrow's methods did not just end lives. They reshaped the minds of the living into tools of their own oppression. What made his cruelty so devastating was its silence. Outside the poorhouse, no one knew. County officials received reports of seasonal sickness, the same that plagued every farm and hamlet. Clergymen preached that the poorhouse was a blessing, that God's work was being done. And yet inside its walls, the chapel bell marked not salvation but erasure, its tolls echoing for those whose names were already crossed out. The first disappearances left no bodies to mourn, no graves to visit. Instead, they left absence, an emptiness that clung to the rooms like damp. Survivors lay awake at night listening to the creak of footsteps and the faint clatter of buckets carrying away what they feared were the remains of their companions. Every cough now felt dangerous, every stumble a sign that they might be chosen. The psychological toll pressed harder than the cold until the poorhouse was filled not with people but with shadows of people broken before they were even gone. Harrow stood above it all, calm, meticulous, his mask of innocence unshaken. To the world outside, he remained the model of restraint and order, the man who managed poverty with discipline. But within the poorhouse, each vanished soul was another step deeper into his ritual of control, another proof that he could shape death to appear natural, that he could hide horror in the thin lines of ink. And as he turned another page of his ledger, he knew he had only begun. By the midwinter of 1846, Elias Harrow's cruelty had begun to evolve beyond ritual into something he believed was science. On his desk, among the ledgers of the dead, sat pamphlets from Europe, writings that spoke of new experiments, new methods of understanding the human body. To the casual eye, they were harmless pages on circulation, respiration, and endurance. To Harrow, they were blueprints for further control. He convinced himself that his killings were not only justified but useful, a contribution to knowledge that others lacked the courage to pursue. Where doctors cut to heal, he cut to measure. Where healers studied recovery, he studied collapse. He abandoned the use of leeches, which he dismissed as primitive, and began to bleed his victims with sharpened reeds. He split himself. The reeds were brittle, their fibers splintering into the veins of the living, leaving behind fragments that festered inside the blood. He strapped residents down, slicing carefully into their arms and legs, placing the reeds so that each pulse of the heart carried infection deeper. The wounds bled not freely but in uneven trickles, and Harrow timed the intervals as though recording the tick of a clock. He wrote notes in the margins of his ledger, counting how long it took for fever to rise, for delirium to set in, for silence to follow. When death came, he did not mourn. He only recorded the duration of decline, as though the body were no more than an hourglass waiting to empty. For others, he devised wooden boxes, narrow enough that a body could only lie flat. Its shoulders pressed to the sides, its chest bound so tight that breathing itself became a struggle. At first, he drilled holes for air, small circles cut into the lid, giving just enough space for the desperate to gasp. Then, while they lay trapped, he would block the holes one by one with wax. He watched from above as their cries shifted from anger to pleading, then to ragged silence, listening with the patience of a man conducting an experiment. He timed how long each could endure before their voices gave way to nothing. And when he finally lifted the lid, he recorded their last expression with a detached curiosity, as though he were sketching the weathered face of a corpse pulled from the sea. These experiments were not hidden in frenzy or rage, but wrapped in calm procedure. Harrow moved through the poorhouse like a clerk, never raising his voice, never breaking his rhythm. To the staff, he appeared methodical, a man endlessly occupied with paperwork and routine. Yet at night they could hear muffled cries from the cellar, hear the scrape of his tools, hear the dragging of buckets across the stone floor. Fear pinned them in place because they knew the ledger could hold their names just as easily, and once written, there was no return. Silence became their only defense, and silence was exactly what Harrow required. The residents who survived long enough to witness his methods were broken in spirit. They saw neighbors carried into the cellar never to return. They smelled infection on the air, the sickly sweetness of wounds that rotted from within. They whispered of the boxes, of how they had seen men with blue lips and wide eyes carried back out, their mouths still open as though begging for air. To them, Harrow was no longer just a warden, but something beyond human, a figure who bent science into cruelty and whose calm face never changed as he dismantled the living. The terror that spread through the poorhouse was not only of dying, but of being measured, tested, and erased like nothing more than a specimen. Harrow himself felt a rising ecstasy in the precision of it all. He told himself he was stripping away the illusions of mercy, revealing the body as it truly was, weak, fragile, bound to fail under pressure. Each victim confirmed his theory that life was only a series of limits, and his task was to find where those limits broke. He called his records statistics of decay, a collection of numbers and times that, in his mind, elevated him above mere cruelty. He was not a murderer, he believed, but a man of progress, a silent scholar of suffering. His ledger had become not just scripture, but laboratory. What made the horror unbearable for those trapped inside was how ordinary he seemed in daylight. He greeted inspectors with calm nods, spoke kindly to visiting ministers, even shared measured words with townsfolk who asked about the state of the residents. His tone was steady, his eyes clear, his papers immaculate. None could imagine that the same hands which poured tea and turned pages were also sealing air holes, driving reeds into veins, and timing the final moments of the forgotten. His disguise was so perfect that the truth seemed impossible, and that impossibility was his greatest weapon. By the spring thaw, dozens had already been reduced to nothing more than notes in his ledger. Their deaths explained away as flux or fever, their bodies dissolved in lime. The survivors carried the weight of what they had seen, not in scars, but in silence, a silence so heavy it crushed even their will to speak to one another. In Harrow's world, torture was not chaos, but order, and with each experiment he grew more certain that he was shaping something greater than the poorhouse itself. He was shaping a doctrine of suffering, and no one beyond those walls could yet see how far it would spread. Beneath the chapel of the poorhouse lay a stone stair that few ever descended, a narrow passage lit only by the faint drip of water and the smell of damp earth. It was here that Elias Harrow built his most private chamber, a room carved from darkness itself, where the boundaries between science and ritual dissolved into one. He had already tested the body with infection and deprivation, but in this secret place he gave death a new meaning, not experiment but ceremony. Harrow did not think of himself as a murderer here. He thought of himself as a priest and each victim as a necessary offering. The chamber was small, its walls lined with lime-stained barrels where the bodies would later dissolve into nothing. At its center stood a wooden table scarred with gouges. Beside it a stool where Harrow would sit in perfect silence. Yet the most disturbing sight was what hung along the wall. Rows of crude wooden masks he carved himself, each hollow-eyed, each shaped with unsettling devotion. Some bore exaggerated smiles, others were twisted with sorrow, others blank as if unfinished. To Harrow, these were not decorations. They were identities. Vessels meant to absorb the final breath of the condemned. When he chose a victim, it was never at random. He waited until their silence was deepest, until despair had stripped them of resistance, for he believed only then could their souls be truly claimed. He strapped them to the table, pressing a mask over their face so tightly the wood cut into their skin. Then he took cloths, soaked in ash, pressing them over mouth and nose. The ash burned the throat and clung to the lungs, choking them as their cries dissolved into muffled gasps beneath the mask. Harrow timed every second, watching as the body writhed and then weakened until at last it grew still. Only then would he remove the cloth, leaving the mask in place as though sealing their final expression for eternity. He called these masks his reliquaries, his collection of saints. To him, they were not victims but martyrs, stripped of individuality and remade as symbols of purity through suffering. Each mask was marked with the date of death, hung carefully upon the wall like icons in a chapel. In the morning he would walk among them, running his fingers over the carved edges, whispering to himself that order was preserved, that silence had been sanctified. The residents became nothing more than faces on wood while their bodies were lowered into barrels of lime until no trace remained but the faint stench of decay. The survivors upstairs did not know what happened in the chamber, but they felt its shadow. They heard faint sounds rising through the chapel floor, muffled cries, the scrape of stools, the creak of rope. They saw Harrow emerge at dawn, his face serene, his hands smelling faintly of ash, as though he had been attending a midnight service. Fear clung to them not because of what they had seen, but because of what they could not name. Each day the chapel seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a mouth swallowing the weak, its hymns drowned by unseen screams. For Harrow, the masks became his scripture. He no longer saw the poorhouse as merely a place to manage the unwanted. It had become a temple, and he its officiant. The county praised him for his precision. The church admired his discipline, but within those stone walls he believed he was creating a sacred order. The suffering of the poor was no longer a burden to him. It was a liturgy, and he alone understood its meaning. The lime barrels were his sacraments, the ledgers his holy text, the masks his saints. To anyone else, the chamber would have been a place of horror. To Harrow, it was the closest thing to paradise. What made this ritual more devastating than his earlier cruelties was the permanence it created. Infection killed slowly, suffocation silenced quickly, but the masks endured. Each mask stared blankly from the wall, an eternal reminder of the erased. They bore witness in silence, their wooden faces capturing a horror no living witness dared to speak aloud. To the few staff who suspected, their mere glimpse was enough to break them. One servant who entered the chamber unbidden fled the poorhouse that very night, never to return, too shaken to put into words what they had seen. The residents continued to disappear, their names crossed neatly from the ledger. Their belongings sold as though they had simply passed away. But beneath the chapel, their faces were preserved. grotesque parodies of saints staring into eternity. The poorhouse was no longer merely a place of slow death. It had become a reliquary of silence, a hidden sanctuary where Harrow perfected the art of annihilation. The terror above ground deepened with each passing day, and though no one could say how, all felt that the chapel itself had turned against them. Its prayers no longer reached heaven. They sank downward into the chamber of masks, swallowed forever by Harrow's private congregation of the dead. By the summer of 1847, the poorhouse received a new kind of arrival. The county courts, eager to be rid of the burden of orphans left behind by disease and debt, began sending children through its doors. Some came in pairs, siblings clinging to one another, their small hands trembling as they were separated from neighbors who could no longer feed them. Others arrived alone, silent with shock, their eyes wide as if already understanding they had been abandoned to something they could not name. To the county, this seemed mercy. Better the children rest under the watch of Elias Harrow than starve on the roadside. To Harrow, their arrival was providence, for he believed that innocence was the rawest clay upon which silence could be carved. Harrow had long studied the fear of the grown, the endurance of the sick, the collapse of the old. But children were different. Their cries carried a purity of sound that unsettled him, a rawness untempered by shame or restraint. To him they were not simply residents, they were instruments, tools through which he could refine his doctrine of suffering. He began what he called his games of silence, cruel rituals cloaked as trials of discipline. The children were not allowed to play in light. Instead, he locked them in pitch-dark corridors, their only companions the rats that scurried along the walls. He left them there for days, giving them only buckets of spoiled milk that curdled in the summer heat. Hunger gnawed at them until desperation overcame disgust, and still they drank, gagging as their bellies twisted. Some survived long enough to crawl out when the door was opened, their eyes wide and blank as though the darkness had taken something that would never return. Others never emerged, their small bodies discovered curled and stiff, the record of their deaths written down neatly as summer flux. Harrow did not stop there. He devised rituals of fire, small torments that carried the weight of eternity. He would coat burning coals in animal fat, slick and glistening, then command children to swallow them whole. Their screams were muffled only by the searing in their throats, their bodies convulsing as heat tore through flesh from within. He timed their collapse, his hand steady as he made notes about endurance, about the limits of innocence, about how quickly the body of a child could betray itself under pressure. For him, the act was not cruelty but revelation. He believed he was reshaping their purity, turning cries into silence, turning life into the perfection of stillness. The survivors of his games carried marks that spoke louder than words. Some could no longer speak at all, their throats scarred and raw. Others rocked in corners, eyes darting at shadows, no longer trusting the light. Their silence was not chosen but forced, and Harrow took this as proof of his success. To him, the transformation of innocence into muteness was not tragedy but triumph, another line in the hidden scripture he built beneath the poorhouse walls. Each mask he carved from wood now seemed to bear the faint outline of a child's face, though he told himself this was coincidence, not conscience. The psychological toll on the other residents was crushing. Mothers who still lived upstairs clutched their children with desperate arms, terrified of the day Harrow's hand might reach for them. The sound of crying in the night, once a mark of life, became unbearable. For each cry risked drawing attention, each sob a beacon that might lead to disappearance. The halls grew quieter, not from peace, but from terror. Even the staff, hardened by months of silence, felt a sickness creep into their bones. They told themselves the children were weak, that disease had taken them, that the records must be true. But in their hearts they knew. They knew the chapel basement was filling with masks too small for adult faces, and they prayed without believing that the truth would never be revealed. Harrow himself felt no burden. He believed the children were gifts sent by the county, vessels to complete his doctrine. Where others saw innocence, he saw raw material. Where others saw cruelty, he saw necessity. He wrote in his private journal that children proved suffering was the natural order, that even purity could be shaped into silence if given time and pressure. He was calm, always calm, his eyes never betraying even a flicker of the horrors he had constructed. His disguise of discipline remained unshaken, and the county continued to praise him as a man of restraint and order. By autumn, the poorhouse had lost more than half of its children, yet the ledgers spoke only of seasonal illness, the so-called summer flux. Officials accepted the explanations without hesitation, comforted by Harrow's precise handwriting and soft voice. The county wanted silence, and Harrow gave it to them in abundance, a silence purchased with the cries of the young. And in the chapel basement the masks multiplied, each one smaller than the last, each one staring with hollow eyes into the void. The children's wing, once filled with nervous laughter and fragile hope, became a place of dread. Doors were kept shut, windows barred, corridors dark. No one dared to linger near it. The sound of play had long vanished, replaced only by the echo of memories that refused to fade. For those who lived on, survival was not life but endurance, a waiting game for the moment the ledger claimed them. And Harrow, satisfied with his collection of silence, knew he had advanced his work. Innocence was no shield, not in his doctrine. In his hands, even the purest voices could be remade into nothing. On the surface, the poorhouse seemed a model of restraint and discipline. Visitors from the county stepped through its gates and found the halls swept clean, the beds made in tight rows, the records precise and orderly. Elias Harrow greeted them at the door with a gentle bow of the head, his voice calm, his manner deferential. He poured tea with the grace of a host, his hands steady. His conversation polite but never indulgent. Judges praised him as a man of honesty. Ministers lauded his Christian charity, and even wealthy patrons who donated scraps of money to the institution admired how well it seemed to function. They saw only what Harrow wished them to see, and they left believing they had walked through a house of mercy. Behind their backs, Harrow concealed the thinning population with careful tricks. He lined the surviving residents in corridors where sunlight softened their faces, presenting them as healthier than they were. He pushed the weakest to the rear, claiming they were in quarantine, too frail to risk contact. When visitors asked about the missing, Harrow had his ledgers ready. Every name was crossed with cause of death, every date exact, every explanation plausible. To officials, these numbers confirmed his diligence. To Harrow, they were trophies, silent monuments to his control. Even as he played the part of the gentle steward, his hands were busy with other work. The belongings of the dead, the threadbare shawls, the boots worn thin at the soles, the lockets clasped to cold necks, were gathered up with care. Publicly, he announced they had been auctioned to raise funds for the poorhouse. Privately, the profits vanished into his accounts, disguised as donations and improvements. The county believed him generous, sacrificing his own comfort for the well-being of the destitute. But the destitute knew better. They saw their companions erased, their lives reduced to possessions that changed hands while their bodies dissolved in lime. The contrast between Harrow's public mask and his hidden atrocities grew unbearable for the few who dared to think about it. Staff members who suspected the truth found themselves trapped in a cage of fear. To speak was to risk becoming the next line in the ledger, their own belongings neatly catalogued, their absence explained away as sickness. They lived in a limbo where every smile Harrow offered to a visiting minister felt like a knife, where every calm word reminded them that his mask was stronger than their screams. The poorhouse was not only a prison for the destitute, but for those who served within it, bound by silence, choked by complicity. For the residents, the mask of normalcy was its own torture. They watched Harrow escort judges through the gardens, his arm bent politely, his expression serene, while they themselves trembled at the thought of nightfall. They heard ministers thank him for his service, unaware that beneath the chapel lay masks carved from the faces of their lost children. The dissonance hollowed their minds. Reality itself felt fractured, as though the world outside belonged to one truth while inside the walls another, darker truth reigned. To survive in such a place meant doubting the evidence of one's own senses, and that doubt was as crushing as hunger or cold. Harrow, for his part, thrived in the duality. To him, the mask was not deception, but proof of mastery. Any man could kill in rage, but only one with true control could kill with one hand while shaking the hand of a judge with the other. He believed himself an artist of appearances, capable of erasing horror so completely that the world above ground would never dare to question him. His calm smile was a weapon as sharp as any reed, as suffocating as any ash-soaked cloth. In his view, the mask of innocence was not a disguise, but the final perfection of his work, the tool that allowed his rituals to continue undisturbed. The county never questioned why the numbers on his pages rose so steadily, why the poorhouse seemed emptier with each passing season. They wanted silence, and Harrow gave it to them. They wanted order, and he delivered it in abundance, even if that order was built on screams buried beneath stone. His mask of normalcy remained unbroken, and with every visit from officials, with every polite exchange of tea, the weight of hidden atrocities pressed heavier on those who knew but could not speak. The poorhouse had become a theater, and Harrow its actor, his performance convincing enough to deceive the powerful while crushing the powerless who lived in the shadows of his lies. The storm arrived without warning. A wall of rain and wind that tore through Indiana's fields, swelling the river until it clawed at its banks with violent hunger. The poorhouse groaned under the weight of the night, its windows rattling like teeth, its roof leaking in streams that stained the ceilings. By morning, when the storm passed, the land bore scars that could not be hidden. Trees lay broken across the road, barns collapsed in heaps of timber. And in the shallow riverbed that wound behind the poorhouse, the rushing waters had stripped away layers of soil. What surfaced was not stone or driftwood, but bones, pale and jagged and scattered like seeds spilled from a careless hand. Children from the village found them first, their laughter turning to screams as they picked up fragments too small to belong to cattle, too fragile to be anything but human. Soon the riverbank was dotted with curious eyes and trembling hands, each villager staring at the remains with the horror of recognition. These were not the relics of war or ancient burials. These bones were fresh enough to carry the faint smell of decay, fresh enough to remind them of neighbors who had gone missing, of paupers they had last seen walking through the gates of the poorhouse and never seen again. The storm had pulled secrets from the ground, secrets Elias Harrow had labored to keep hidden in silence and lime. The whispers spread like fire through dry fields. How could so many bones appear? When the poorhouse reported every death as natural and dignified, why had no coffins been lowered into the churchyard, no names called at funerals? The villagers murmured in taverns and markets, at the steps of churches, their voices hushed yet sharp with suspicion. For years they had ignored the odd silence that followed each disappearance, convincing themselves that disease had claimed the poor as it always did. But now, faced with the physical remains, the doubts they had buried surfaced with terrible force. When county officials arrived, Harrow met them at the gates as he always did, his demeanor calm, his ledgers pristine. He walked them to the riverbank, his hands folded behind his back, his face composed in gentle sorrow. With soft words, he explained that the storm had disturbed old graves from a distant cemetery upstream, washing the remains downriver. He spoke of erosion, of the shifting earth, of the natural cycle of death. His voice never wavered, his gaze steady, as though he himself had been shocked and saddened by the sight. The officials, untrained and unwilling to see malice in the man they trusted, nodded at his explanation. They wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him, for to admit otherwise would mean facing the enormity of complicity. Yet beneath the calm surface, panic brewed. Survivors within the poorhouse whispered that the bones belonged to those who had screamed in the night, to children whose cries had been smothered, to mothers who had vanished without trace. Their whispers slipped out into the village, carried by trembling hands and broken voices. Tales spread of muffled shrieks rising through the chapel floor, of footsteps dragging bodies through corridors at dawn, of masks carved with faces that never returned. The more the county tried to accept Harrow's explanation, the louder the rumors became. The storm had not only unearthed bones but loosened the silence that had smothered the poorhouse for years. Fear spread outward, wrapping itself around the nearby towns. Parents warned their children not to stray near the river, not to walk by the poorhouse walls after dark. Farmers crossing the road looked away as though the sight of the building itself was a curse. But when questions rose to officials, they hesitated. Harrow had always been polite, efficient, reliable. He kept the burden of the poor out of sight, out of mind. He relieved the county of its shame and presented them with ledgers that balanced neatly without excess or scandal. To accuse him now would mean admitting their own blindness, their own willingness to accept his mask. And so they chose caution. They chose to doubt their own people rather than the man who served them tea and smiled with humility. Inside the poorhouse, Harrow sensed the shift but did not falter. He knew appearances mattered more than truth, that bureaucracy craved order even more than justice. He continued his rituals in the chapel basement, continued feeding the lime with bodies, continued carving masks that stared with hollow eyes. To him, the storm was not a threat, but a test, a chance to prove how firmly silence could be restored. And as the officials left reassured, as the villagers whispered in fear but took no action, Harrow smiled faintly to himself. Evil, he knew, did not need violence in the open. It thrived in the comfort of paperwork, in the refuge of polite denial, in the cracks of a system that preferred neat explanations over unbearable truths. The river carried the bones further downstream, scattering them into fields and forests where they would be found one by one. Each fragment another whisper against the mask of normalcy. Yet no grave would be dug, no memorial built, no official confession made. The collapse of silence had begun, but it was slow, fragile, uncertain, a collapse that revealed how tightly evil clung to its disguise and how much the world depended on that disguise to keep itself from breaking apart. Years passed before the truth of Elias Harrow's mind revealed itself in words that could no longer be dismissed as rumor or fear. After his death, when the poorhouse was left in the hands of temporary caretakers, a priest assigned to cleanse the chapel found a small iron chest hidden beneath the altar stone. It was locked with a rusted clasp, its surface stained by years of damp. But inside he discovered something that made his hands tremble. Folded into the chest were notebooks bound in cracked leather, their pages thick with Harrow's script. Each letter was careful, steady, and mercilessly precise, as if the man had been writing scripture rather than confession. These were not diaries of guilt or repentance. They were records of doctrine, cold accounts of torture described as though they were experiments, as though human agony was nothing more than a series of calculations. The priest read in silence, his lips moving though no prayer came forth. Harrow had written of the old and the sick as waste flesh, remnants of a society too weak to sustain themselves. He described the children as unformed silence, their cries necessary proof that innocence could be reshaped into obedience through pain. He wrote of reed splinters left to fester in veins, of air holes sealed one by one, of masks pressed against faces until the final breath rattled into stillness. Each entry read like a laboratory report, each experiment assigned a number, a time, a result. There was no rage in the words, no madness spilling uncontrolled across the page. The sentences were neat, disciplined, structured with the same order he had shown in his ledgers. And that order was more terrifying than chaos, for it proved that his cruelty had been methodical, not impulsive, built from belief rather than accident. The notebooks revealed not only the methods but the philosophy behind them. Harrow believed that the poor were born not to live but to be studied, reduced, and erased. He wrote that society had erred by feeding and clothing them, that mercy only prolonged decay. In his vision, the poorhouse was not a place of refuge but a crucible where weakness could be burned away, where suffering became proof of order. He described himself as the hand of correction, tasked with transforming chaos into silence, erasing noise from the world until only order remained. To him, every mask was a saint, every body dissolved in lime a sacrifice necessary for a better world. The horror lay not only in what he did, but in how calmly he justified it. The priest who found the journals read until his stomach twisted with nausea, until the words blurred into a haze of terror. He realized that Harrow had never hidden his atrocities from himself. On the contrary, he had preserved them with the care of a scholar preserving truth for future generations. These were not confessions born of regret. They were records meant to endure. To destroy them felt dangerous, as if burning the pages would not erase the poison but release it into the air. Yet to keep them intact risked allowing the evil to live on, whispering into new hands. The church authorities were summoned. Bishops and elders gathered in a locked chamber, the notebooks spread across a table as though they were relics of blasphemy. Each man read in turn, their faces pale, their lips pressed tight, none daring to voice what weighed on their hearts. They debated whether to reveal the writings, to expose the county to the full knowledge of what had occurred beneath the chapel floor. But fear overcame duty, fear that the words would inspire rather than condemn, that Harrow's doctrine of suffering might infect other minds, that the poorhouse would become a legend too dark to contain. And so the decision was made to seal the journals, to bury them in the church archives where no one would read them again. Officially, they claimed that nothing of importance had been found, that the poorhouse had been a place of natural hardship, nothing more. But secrets once discovered never vanish completely. Whispers of the journals spread quietly among priests, among officials, among townsfolk who sensed that something had been hidden. They spoke of writings too terrible to read aloud, of a doctrine so cold it turned men's blood to ice. The county lived with a poisoned memory, a knowledge half acknowledged, never spoken in sermons yet never forgotten. Families who had lost their kin in the poorhouse carried the weight of this silence like a curse. They could not grieve openly, for there were no graves, no confessions, only the shadow of words sealed away by men too afraid to face them. The memory of Elias Harrow grew monstrous with each telling. To some he remained the polite warden who had served tea to judges and ministers, his mask intact. To others he became a figure of dread, a phantom whose calm voice still echoed in the chapel walls. The journals, though hidden, had already done their work. They proved that evil did not always scream or strike in rage. Sometimes it whispered with patience, wrote with careful hands, and smiled while erasing lives. No sermon could cleanse the county of that truth. The unsealed confessions remained in the air, unseen yet suffocating, a reminder that what had been done in silence could never be fully buried. By the time the poorhouse finally closed its doors, the official ledgers bore the names of 108 dead. Each entry was signed with neat precision, each cause of death explained in words that seemed harmless: fever, flux, malnutrition, weakness of the lungs. Yet when families came searching for graves, there were none. The churchyard held no markers, no wooden crosses, no plots turned with spades. It was as if 108 lives had vanished into air, reduced to nothing more than lines of ink that gave the illusion of dignity where only erasure remained. For those left behind, grief was not sharp, but empty, a hollow that stretched across generations. Without bodies to mourn, sorrow became suspicion, and suspicion became a wound that never healed. In the years that followed, reformers seized upon the horror as proof that the system of poorhouses and asylums required oversight. Laws were written demanding burial records, requiring that coffins be witnessed and graves marked, that officials be appointed to account for each death with eyes rather than paper. Committees were formed to inspect institutions, though often their work was as thin as the pages of their reports. Still, Elias Harrow's legacy lived in these reforms not as an honored name but as a warning spoken in hushed tones. The poorhouse became a lesson carved into policy, that silence breeds cruelty, that unchecked authority rots from within, and that neatness on the page can conceal screams below. Yet the reforms could not cleanse the county of its stain. Whispers endured, drifting through taverns and churchyards, stories told in fragments of what had been uncovered after the storm, of bones that had surfaced in the riverbed, of masks hung upon the basement walls. Farmers swore they had seen one of the masks years later, purchased at auction under the guise of folk art, its hollow eyes staring blankly from a parlor shelf. Collectors whispered of others passed quietly between hands, relics stripped of their history but carrying a weight that could not be erased. Each mask was a face denied burial, a reminder of the silence that had devoured children and elders alike. They survived as trophies of horror, their presence proof that evil, once shaped into an object, never fully disappears. For the survivors who had escaped the poorhouse walls, life was marked by shadows that would never lift. Some spoke of dreams in which they were strapped to wooden frames, waiting for drops of boiling water to fall, waking with burns that no fire had touched. Others lived in silence, unable to describe the nights when screams seeped up through the chapel floor, unable to reconcile the kindness Harrow displayed before officials with the terror he commanded behind closed doors. They carried the knowledge like a disease, infecting their families, their children, their grandchildren with a sense that trust itself was dangerous. The poorhouse did not simply kill. It reshaped the minds of all who entered, teaching them that evil wears the face of civility, that cruelty hides best in calmness. The county tried to forget, but forgetting was impossible. Rumors reached surrounding towns, stories of the warden who spoke softly to judges while carving masks from the faces of the dead. Children whispered his name as though he were a specter, a figure who would return in the night if silence was broken. Adults lowered their voices when the poorhouse was mentioned, afraid that acknowledging the truth would make it too real. The building itself was left to rot, its windows shattered by storms, its walls swallowed by ivy. Yet even as it crumbled, the memory of what had occurred there remained more solid than stone, a weight pressing down on the land like ash that could not be swept away. The legacy of Elias Harrow was not measured in monuments or plaques, but in absence. The absence of graves, the absence of names spoken aloud, the absence of justice. He had proven how thoroughly horror could disguise itself, How easily society would accept silence if it meant avoiding shame. His evil was not the chaos of war or the frenzy of bloodied battlefields. It was the quiet evil of bureaucracy, of neat signatures and calm explanations, of cruelty hidden behind records so orderly that no one dared to question them. It was a lesson that lingered long after the building was abandoned, that some of the worst crimes are not the ones shouted in fury but the ones written down in careful ink, filed away and forgotten. And yet, even as reforms hardened, even as officials swore to never again allow such silence, the question remained, could it happen again? Could another Harrow rise in another institution wearing another mask of discipline, reducing lives to numbers while the world looked away? The answer whispered through every archive, every sealed journal, every story left unfinished. For as long as men craved order more than truth, as long as appearances mattered more than voices, the possibility remained. Evil does not need open fields of slaughter. It thrives best in quiet rooms where paperwork hides screams, where ash-soaked cloths leave no stains, where the dead are denied even the dignity of a grave. The poorhouse closed in silence, its halls empty, its ledgers gathering dust. But silence is not the same as peace. Silence is the soil in which memory festers, in which whispers grow until they become unbearable. The story of Elias Harrow did not end with the closing of his institution. It seeped into the conscience of a county, into the ink of laws, into the cautionary tales told to children who were warned never to trust too easily in the calmness of men. And even now, long after the walls have fallen, the masks remain, scattered in private collections, hidden in attics, relics of a time when suffering was given order and silence was worshipped as perfection. The legacy of ashes was not his alone. It belonged to all who looked away, all who praised his neat records, all who accepted silence in place of truth. Evil thrived not because it was invisible, but because it was disguised as normal. And so the story ends not with closure, but with a question that still haunts the air. What do you think? Could this happen again?